Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Western Spirit. Today we have someone very special. Jonathan Sacerdoti is a journalist, a commentator, and an advocate for bringing the clarity and balance to current events. And ever since October 7th, I've seen Jonathan more and more on my TV screen in a very, I guess, uh, um, a UK media state in which the truth is rarely shown. And Jonathan is able to break through all the bull, so to speak, in American English, and he's able to give us and the viewers in the UK and around the world, whoever is watching like me from Israel, the truth to cut through all the propaganda. So, Jonathan, it's a true honor to speak with you.
Well, very kind of you, and it's great to speak with you too. Good to be with you.
So, Jonathan, you published an article in the I forgot which
The Spectator.
in the Spectator, which is a very good magazine, and I advise all to go read it. And in the article, you're basically, the title is the UK, is Britain now a friend or a foe of Israel? And I'd like, maybe instead of just asking you about it, maybe you can just tell us what you wrote. Are you a friend or foe in Israel in the UK?
Well, I think it's an important question. And the reason I wrote the column is because there is some confusion. And I would say for many years, not just under this government, Britain has been acting in a slightly split personality way when it comes to Israel. What I mean by that is that on the one hand, there's really close collaboration between the two countries. Whether it's in terms of trade or whether it's security cooperation, intelligence sharing, even military cooperation. But on the other hand, there's this kind of tendency in public for politicians to condemn Israel or to speak out against things they think are wrong with Israel, and then to say, well, we're doing this as a critical friend. This is what good allies do. And I think that particularly now, particularly since October the 7th, and even more particularly since the election of our current Labour government around a year ago, this tendency has been ever more pronounced. So we've seen the government constantly taking steps to try to show that they disapprove of Israel, especially in terms of Israel's actions in the war going on at the moment. And that has ranged from this introduction of a sort of partial arms embargo to the imposition of sanctions on two cabinet ministers within the Israeli government, to threats of worse or more, to chatter and rumors about recognizing Palestinian statehood in the middle of this war, all sorts of things like that. And it seems to be fairly well accepted that people know why that's happening. They say, well, it's because they have to satisfy their base, by which people tend to mean a large Muslim portion of the electorate or the population who they think will be wooed by this. And also, it's a Labour government. So the harder left part of their electorate, which they feel again is instinctively anti-Israel and would disapprove of all these things. And so the article was really there just to highlight that while that is all happening, there is still actually very close cooperation, even I would say in some ways reliance on that relationship. And what really triggered it, it's something I'd had in mind for a while, was that there was this press release sent out mostly to Israeli-facing press by the British Embassy in Israel, which was trumpeting the amazing relationship between the two countries in terms of trade. It was trying to suggest that Britain is taking these new actions under this government to make it easier and better to be more successful in certain key areas, I think 8 of them, for business, and that Israel played into all of these, and this was a wonderful opportunity. It seemed that this was completely at odds with the message that they were trying to send out more generally and broadly speaking. And so I felt it was about time that I should write this piece just to say, it's time you decide, really. Are you with the country that's on the front line of the fight against jihadism, Islamist terrorism, Islamic extremism, fighting really existential enemies, not just to Israel, but to the entire West? Or are you not on their side? And maybe you should pick a side, state it clearly and proudly, and then hope that actually the majority of the great British population understands that principled position if you pick the right side.
You know what was really interesting? As I was reading your article last night, because I had to read some of it at least so I know what we're talking about. But as I was reading it, I started thinking it sort of sounds like the Arab nations around Israel, where On the one hand, they need Israel for security, their economy, water. Like Jordan uses all their water almost from Israel, and their security. Without Israel helping their security, they would fall to the Muslim Brotherhood a long time ago. Egypt has used Israeli intelligence and security against ISIS and the Muslim Brotherhood for years, and yet the rhetoric is so anti-Israel because of their local populations that hate Jews. That's basically it. And we had Egyptians on the show that basically part of the national identity as right now is to hate Jews, and so the government needs to give their sort of one Arabic speaking tongue saying we hate Israel, we're fighting Israel, and then in English and in Hebrew when they're talking to us, they'll say, "Oh, we're good friends. Let's have." There is a cooperation behind the scenes, and so I was thinking about it. I was like, "This is very weird. It almost sounds the same in a way." So, economically in Hebrew, we'll say we're doing all this good stuff with you guys, and then back home, because of the local politics, we'll say, "No, no, 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 no. We the Israeli government, and look at these ministers. We're putting on the sanctions." So, do you think there's a sort of, I guess, does it make sense what I'm saying?
To some extent, absolutely, it makes sense. And the widely accepted explanation for this behavior here, as I said, is that they are assumed to be saying this for the benefit of a portion of the electorate that they think will be turned off by cooperation or collaboration with Israel. And people are specific about that. There is a sizable minority of the British electorate that is Muslim, and this has become something of a litmus test for Muslim voters. Gaza, Israel, these are sort of code words. Obviously, there is a great deal of sympathy among that part of the population with the Palestinian cause, which says quite a lot in and of itself, because on the one hand, people say, "Oh, it's not about religion; it's about land and indigeneity." But on the other hand, when you find that a large portion of the population, the Muslim population here, is motivated by this war, which they may have no particular actual affiliation with or connection to. For example, if they're Pakistani British Muslims, so effectively, what is happening is a sign that it is about religion. It's about Islam versus Judaism. Obviously, that's to simplify it quite a lot. But I will say that if this becomes a knee-jerk reaction or a sort of automatic position for Muslims within the UK, it maybe shed some light on what might be underneath a lot of that for many people. But yes, I think that is correct. And there are people in the UK who are alarmed at the influence and power, let's say, of certain extreme parts of the Muslim population. And one has to be really careful saying things like that because, I think a lot of Jewish people are hesitant to talk about it because the same has often been said about us. Jews have too much power. They're this powerful, manipulative minority group that wield power, that instill fear in politicians. And of course, we know that isn't correct. We take it to be deeply anti-Semitic, and we've seen in our history many times over just how badly it goes when people say those sorts of things. And so there is a hesitation to then say it about other minority groups. And yet there is this lingering feeling, not just among Jewish people, but among a lot of British people who aren't Jewish, that there is an element of that going on as well. And I think that these are very thorny and difficult issues to discuss, but that's probably why we should discuss them rather than not discuss them. And we should do it sensitively and carefully and considerately about each other, because we are ultimately, at the end of the day, fellow citizens of Great Britain. And the whole aim is that we should get along and live alongside each other peacefully and collaboratively and even fruitfully. So I think it is important that we're considerate and careful when we talk about them. But I think it is even more important that we do talk about them.
Yes, but I would also say the difference is that the hatred of Jews was based a lot on not on untruths, whereas in the fear of a growing minority that doesn't share values, I guess, that are aligned with. For example, you tell me there was all these polls about British Muslims that show that a significant portion of younger British Muslims, for example, pretty much want Israel not to exist anymore and support Hamas and all these other opinions that are that it's just a matter of fact to state if you have this opinion, whether you're a Muslim or not Muslim, it's dangerous. And when you have such a large majority of people that happen to be Muslims that hold this opinion, then it is a dangerous thing to say. So I don't the I don't really understand the fear of saying it. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't know.
No, I think you've hit the nail on the head, Ariel, which is absolutely correct. I think that the issue of values is one that is ever more important in the West, well, across the whole world. But I think in the West, because we have a level of confusion or uncertainty about our values now, and I'll agree with you that there are certain cultural backgrounds, ideologies, philosophies, even religions, which have values and ideas which aren't really in line with, in tune with, in harmony with those values that we've traditionally held to be very important here in Great Britain or elsewhere in the West. And with Judaism, I think it's not the case, because many of those values were based on Jewish values. So Christianity, having grown out from Judaism, we talk about Judeo-Christian values. Again, a generalized term, but it's there because we have a lot in common, and those values of Judaism and Christianity have come to be the foundational values in many respects of places like the United Kingdom. And so Jews, I think, when they have lived in the UK for hundreds of years after being readmitted, have usually, in general terms, integrated well and contributed greatly to the population without much challenge of the, let's say, cultural makeup of the nation or its values and ethics and culture. And I think that there has been undeniably an element of tension with some of the growth of the Muslim population in the UK, and a lot of discussion and debate over the years over how that should be tackled, really. So in the 90s, we had the idea under the Tony Blair government, this idea of multiculturalism, which was not to say that just that we should be a nation with lots of different cultures in it or lots of different immigrant communities, but that actually those communities didn't need to integrate into British culture and could coexist in sort of little enclaves or almost ghettos. So you could exist with your own cultural co-religionists or people who have come from a similar part of the world as you in communities around the UK, often without even learning English. This was considered to be a good idea or an acceptable idea, and that somehow or other that wouldn't be detrimental to the overall culture and coexistence in the state. Now, I think that over the years that has been very clearly shown to have been a bad idea. I think some of us said it for a long time. Others have come around to it more recently. But I do think that it's a growing area of agreement among certainly a large number of people that that was a bad idea. It's not a consensus for sure still. And so, yes, I think when there are elements of a philosophy or a religion or a set of rules which seem contradictory, at least, let's say, to some of the British values or Western values that we hold so dear, some of us, then there is a bit of a problem. And that hasn't happened so much in the case of Jews or Jewish immigrants, but I think it has happened more noticeably with many Muslim immigrant populations. And I will say, again, it's important to say it, that doesn't mean that all Muslims don't fit in the UK, and it doesn't mean that all Muslims subscribe to those ideas. There are many Muslim people in the UK who've contributed greatly to society, and many parts of the Muslim population here who don't have sympathy for terrorism or suicide bombings and the like. But you mentioned some polling. There has been polling. There was an interesting piece of research done by the Henry Jackson Society, I think it was in 2024, which had some alarming headline figures that did the rounds. Only 1 in 4 British Muslims believed that Hamas committed murder and rape in Israel on October the 7th. Only 1 in 4 British Muslims believe Israel has a right to exist as a Jewish homeland. Almost half of British Muslims, that study said, felt more sympathy with Hamas than Israel. 53% of 18 to 34-year-old Muslims said they were more likely to sympathize with Hamas. So again, not Palestinians, not the Palestinian cause, but Hamas. Those sorts of things should be alarming to British people. Hamas is, of course, a proscribed terror group in the UK.
This episode is brought to you by Ayn Rand Center Israel. We meet every alternate Friday to study and discuss the philosophy of Ayn Rand, author of The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged. The topics range from ethics to politics, reason versus faith, aesthetics, psychology, and much, much more. This is the only place in Israel where Ayn Rand's unique philosophy is accessible to you, and you're welcome to come learn all about it. It's a great opportunity to learn and meet really interesting people. Attendance is free, and first-timers get a free book. We meet every alternate Friday at the WeWork in Serona Market, and we like to keep the intellectual discussion going afterwards with some great food and drinks. Click the link for more info on Ayn Rand Center Israel.
Yeah, and also I would say one last thing on this topic is the fact that in the last election, and you know more about this than I am because I'm not from the UK, but there was a number of seats that were won by candidates that their entire platform for being a member of parliament in the UK parliament was Gaza. And so you had, and what this shows to me is that those people, they didn't come to their constituents and say, we're going to fix the potholes in your streets. We're going to make your life easier. We're going to make you have more jobs or whatever it is that politicians usually promise to get elected. Instead, they went to our brothers in Gaza. We'll protect them. We'll be your voice for the Gazans. And any country where your main source of being elected is, we'll help people thousands or hundreds of thousands of miles or kilometers away, there's a problem there. Whether it's Gaza, Bangladesh, or India, or whatever, a local politician should be a local politician, no?
That's right. And what I've said about those independent MPs is this, that we have obviously quite a different electoral system to that in Israel. And generally speaking, we have this first past the post system, which means that between the two main parties, Labour and Conservative, we tend to get more decisive wins where one of those parties can make a relatively strong government. Now, there have been exceptions over the years. Quite recently, in recent living memory, the Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition was one example. But generally speaking, smaller parties don't do so well. That's one of the strengths of the system, though perhaps you could argue it's less democratically representative in what it delivers. But what happened in the last election is that the Labour landslide was somewhat tempered by this election of, I think it was 4 independent MPs who stood in strategic seats against Labour MPs. And as you said, they coordinated. There was a website, I think, called something like the Muslim Vote, which again is very clear in its intention, and it explained to voters how to vote strategically to unseat a Labour MP or to deny them the seat in the election. And those who were elected did indeed talk about Gaza. This was kind of like a one-word manifesto. And you can conclude for yourself what Gaza meant. Did it mean anything about the Levant? I'm not sure if it did. Or was it a sort of dog whistle or code word, a sort of shibboleth that basically signified something else? That is my suspicion, mostly because Britain has almost no influence at the moment, or back then, in what's happening in Gaza or in Israel's decisions in this war. In fact, all of this posturing, this is the other thing I was trying to say in the Spectator column, all of this posturing on these issues actually isn't really going to make any difference to the Palestinians or to Israel. It's just going to make a difference to the relevance of Great Britain in these important world affairs, which is to say it's going to make us less relevant, less important, just less listened to. And rather than taking a realistic, pragmatic approach to what is a complicated conflict and an even more complicated war, Britain is sort of indulging some of the more cynical parts of the electorate and indeed of the House of Commons now, with these particular people sitting and some backbenchers within the Labour Party itself who share perhaps similar views. And that's not going to help Britain. And just to go back to those members who now sit as independents, that you can add to them Jeremy Corbyn, who is the former Labour leader, who pretty much aligns with their views on Israel and some would say Jews. Indeed, he was kicked out of the Labour Party by the current leader, the current Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, because of things he said about anti-Semitism. after the Labour Party was found to have been institutionally anti-Semitic by the Equalities and Human Rights Commission, a body started by a previous Labour government. So the point is that we are then left with these independents sitting in Parliament who actually, while they're not united formally as a party, are effectively a caucus which is united by, I suppose, Islam or Muslim voters or this dog whistle issue of Gaza. And that to me is quite extraordinary because religion doesn't tend traditionally to have played a big part in British politics in modern times. In fact, if you started, let's say, a Christian Democrat Party in the UK, you'd probably do quite badly. There's this idea that we don't do God. In America, it's more important to talk about God and religion. But here in the UK, it's almost a faux pas. And yet we now have these people who are united by their attitude towards religion. And that religion is not the religion or the majority religion of this country. It is Islam. So we almost have a political Islamic party in the British Parliament, which should, I think, send fear into every person in this country, because that is effectively like having a Muslim Brotherhood party in the UK. And if it's 4 or 5 people now, there is, of course, the risk that that grows into something greater. Remember, again, people are talking about the risk from Reform UK, which itself, again, similar number of MPs were voted in. Reform UK, for those who don't know, is the party that's led by Nigel Farage, who is a very successful politician in leading Britain to leave the EU with the Brexit vote, who now sits in Parliament, and he leads that party, which by some polls at the moment could actually win an election, which would be extraordinary because of the system I explained to you earlier, where we normally have a Labour or a Conservative government. So if a similar number of Reform MPs could pose that sort of threat, people need to think carefully about whether a number of Muslim MPs or Muslim sympathetic MPs, and I say that because they stood on that basis, not because that's how I'm defining them. I think that we're in very interesting, if slightly alarming times in British politics because of that.
One thing that I do not understand is that you would think, okay, the Israel thing, you explained why it's a thorny political issue. So they need to thread the line. On the one hand, let's say we don't want to get our constituents angry. We won't want people to run against our MPs in the next election from the Gaza side like they did in larger numbers. So we're going to be more ambivalent. We're going to criticize Israel, put these weird and I don't know the right word, but like really, I think, disgusting sanctions on Israeli ministers, not because I agree with everything the Israeli ministers do or say, but because of the double standard. And you've spoken about that also. But okay, we can maybe understand this in what your article said also, but the Iran thing doesn't make any sense to me, because there are no Iranian caucuses in the parliament, in the UK parliament. There's no people that are clamoring to say we need to save Iran. At least I don't think so. There's no quote unquote genocide that Israel is doing to Iran until the attack. There's nothing. There's a nuclear program that Israel is taking out, the US is taking out, and then your foreign secretary, whatever it's called, is asked Lammy whether he supports the American attack, not even the Israeli attack, the American attack. And he says, well, we had nothing to do about it. But that wasn't the question. The question is whether the UK has anything, does it support it? Is it against it? You also had your attorney general or whatever it's called in your country saying that this might be a war crime actually. And so what I don't understand, maybe you can explain to me, why do they feel the need not to support it's a successful strike, jump on the bandwagon of the winner? Why not?
Well, I think the first important thing to say about our Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, is that he's not famed for his intelligence. Just to which, if anyone hasn't seen it outside the UK, it's worth looking up an episode of Mastermind, a British quiz show in which he featured some years ago as a sort of celebrity edition. It's like a general knowledge quiz. It's very, very long running. And in that, I mean, for example, he suggested that Henry VII came after Henry VIII. upon his death in the line of succession in British kings and queens. So that aside, I say that only half in jest. He genuinely doesn't come across as a very intelligent man. But in terms of British policy on Iran, you are right that it should be different from British policy, let's say, on Gaza. And I think it was to some extent. I think that there was less condemnation and finger wagging. But you must also remember that Britain is very war wary. Because of Afghanistan and Iraq, there is kind of a tendency to shy away from any military engagement or wars. And I think that is something that looms large, particularly over the Labour Party again. So I think there is a desire to try to avoid sounding too enthusiastic about military engagements, even if they are entirely justified. And so if America is going to take something like that on, well, Britain can, stand on the sidelines and try and let that happen without having to get involved itself. And again, I think that's part of this doublespeak I was talking about in terms of Israel and British-Israel relations. I think it exists in other areas, that Britain is, at this stage in its history, willing sometimes to just take a back seat. It doesn't like the idea. It wants to pretend it's a front row player. It wants to pretend that it's an important actor. So they will talk about it, but they won't necessarily come out and join in or even wholeheartedly or full-throatedly support that kind of military action. Let's not forget that Britain did, in fact, help a bit during some of what's been going on. Britain helped in some of the defensive measures, I believe, against the Iranian ballistic missiles the first time, not during the so-called 12-day war, as named by President Trump. But there has been some involvement. I think, though, that on the other hand, Britain has been clear about, under this government especially, a partial kind of sanctioning of trades, not really, but saying that it's going to stop trade negotiations towards a free trade deal, because Britain, again, has a trade deal with Israel, but it's very old. It dates back to the one that Israel made, I think, in the 90s with the EU. And so under the last government here, the Conservative government, then Trade Secretary Kemi Badenoch, who is now the leader of the opposition, the leader of the Conservative Party, traveled to Israel. I was actually with her on that trip covering it. And she was talking about how Britain and Israel had this healthy trade relationship, needed this new trade agreement that would reflect the modern version, because effectively, she said, that old version kind of treated Israel like an agrarian economy, which isn't really the case anymore. So this government said at one point, a few weeks back, no, we're going to pause all talks towards a trade deal at the moment because we don't like how Israel is acting in Gaza. The two things pretty much unrelated, very childish, I would say, very stupid, but also not beneficial for the UK to do so. And the reason being is that, on the one hand, in terms of trade, the two countries do have a good relationship that benefits the UK as much as Israel. But on the other hand, on the actual issues they're doing this over, like you say, Iran, Israel's actions are doing a massive favor to Britain, to the West. As the Germans said, they're doing our dirty work for us. A nuclear-armed Iran is dangerous. And to that end, again, another thing that prompted me to write that piece this week was this report that just came out here in the UK. It's a report that said that it was from the Intelligence and Security Committee, and it was the result of, I think, more than a year of investigation into the threat from the Islamic Republic of Iran in the UK. And they are deemed by that committee to be a very big terror threat. They stated that there have been 15 foiled assassination and kidnapping plots on British soil that have been carried out by the regime in Iran. Previously, I think the head of MI5 or MI6 said something like 20 previous attempts that have been foiled. So we're talking many attempts. And yet, despite this very, very pronounced threat from that regime, Britain seemed to be hesitant over supporting Israel's actions and America's actions in taking out a lot of that Iranian threat. So I do agree. It doesn't really make a lot of sense.
Okay, I want to also now talk about Jews, because we're in Israel. I've known a number of British Jews that have made Aliyah, that have come to live in Israel, for those who aren't good with the Israeli jargon, that have come to move to Israel after October 7th. A few of them even moved close to where I live in Petah Tikva, and we've gotten to know them over time. And I always think it's so weird. We have this war here going on almost 2 years now. I have neighbors who lost limbs, people who've died. I have friends from my reserves before I lost my eyesight. I was in Golani and the reserves also. They're in Gaza now, or in Lebanon or wherever. They haven't been with their families for months on end. And if they're not going to be injured, God forbid, or killed, God forbid, they're still not with their families. Their children are growing up without them. And people are moving to Israel. And when I ask why, there's two reasons. The number one is obviously we feel a connection, whatever. But why now? And the answer is because the UK has become unlivable for Jews. And a lot of Jews, and you'll tell me maybe how prevalent this is, but is it really a fact that a lot of Jews feel, like the Jews that I've met here, that it's becoming unlivable anymore to be a Jew in the UK?
I think it's no exaggeration to say that that is absolutely the case. I mean, the front page of today's Daily Telegraph, the day that we're recording this, has the headline "Anti-Semitism Normalized in Middle-Class Britain." And it's a report that has been carried out, a sort of inquiry into anti-Semitism in the UK, carried out because of the Board of Deputies of British Jews who led it. But they got two politicians from either side of the aisle, one Labour, one Conservative, John Mann and Penny Mordaunt, two respected politicians, to carry out this inquiry into anti-Semitism. And the two of them have written that what they found was deeply shocking. It made them extremely concerned and worried. I think the important thing to note as well, by the way, is that neither of them is Jewish. They are non-Jews. And what I'm trying to communicate as urgently as I can in a lot of the work and events and speaking and things that I do here is that this should be of massive concern, not just to Jewish people. Obviously, it's of concern to Jewish people. That goes without saying. And I have a lot to say on that topic, speaking with other Jews. But I think that it really should be something that non-Jewish people think about deeply and carefully as well. And that seemed to be what the two of them were saying in what they wrote in the Telegraph. The report itself is out in a few days. And they say that this is not good for the country. And that this is not good for the country in a number of ways, if you ask me. One is that Jews have contributed and continue to contribute enormously to this nation. And if they are leaving or feeling like they might leave, that should be really very alarming. And more than just that, I think everybody knows that it's a symptom of something greater rather than an end in itself. So once all the Jews have left, this problem won't go away. The Jews are a symptom. And it's as Einat Wilf says, Jews have a timing problem. Britain might right itself, but the timing problem we Jews have is that often things right themselves after we've had to make a very difficult decision, maybe to leave ourselves, and we could be the first casualty. So yes, they might manage to plug the leak in the dam before the whole thing bursts, but the bit of damage done in the beginning is often to Jewish people. And I think that many Jewish people are in that position now. I'm somebody who's warned about this for many years in my work, and for a good portion of that, lots of people would say to me quietly, "Don't you think you're overdoing it? Aren't you a bit extreme? I think you might be exaggerating." And to be fair, I didn't think I was. I've always tried not to be too alarmist. I'm still here. I didn't leave, but I did, along with many others or some others, give warnings about what might happen. Now, many of those people who used to say those things to me quietly have come to me and said, "Gosh, maybe you were right," or "I think it's happening now, even if it wasn't when you said it," or words to those effects. Now, it doesn't make me feel good at all. It makes me feel quite bad that perhaps I and others failed to make the impression that we needed to, maybe when it would have been easier to try to redress some of the problems. I will say this as well, that the other thing about Israel at this very tense moment in world history is that to be there at the moment, especially for Jewish people or people who know the place well, is actually quite invigorating and recharging. And that sounds quite strange to say to some people in Israel and to many people outside Israel, because why would it be recharging or invigorating to be in one of the hottest war zones in the world? Well, the reason is because that war is a manifestation of the conflict that is potentially coming all around the globe. And at least to be in a country which is already engaged in that battle, but more importantly, is engaged in that battle in a way that shows that it has, generally speaking, a really clear idea of what the battle lines are, of who the players are, of what the important elements are, of what we're even fighting for. That is something which is ideologically, intellectually, academically, and spiritually very reassuring. Obviously, the realities of war are far from reassuring. When I was there during the 12-day engagement with Iran, like everybody else, I was hiding in a bomb shelter twice a night on average, 2 a.m., 4 a.m., not going anywhere that was too far from shelters. It's not fun to be hiding from ballistic missiles. And unlike previous times when we've had to run into shelters in Israel, in central Israel, in Tel Aviv, where I was, we actually heard the booms. We saw the damage to the people around us. Like you, I know people whose homes were destroyed. And indeed, I think 28 people were killed. So it's certainly not that it feels good to be among that. But at the same time, many Jewish people are saying it feels more dangerous existentially to be in a society that doesn't even know it's at war, in a society that doesn't even know what is being challenged, in a society that doesn't even know what it stands for itself. So how can it possibly defend itself? And those are the things I think that many Jewish people are feeling when they're thinking about or even deciding to move to Israel at this time. The people that I'm thinking about quite a lot at the moment are my non-Jewish friends who quietly get in touch with me and say, I don't know where we will go. We don't have an Israel to go to. We don't necessarily have a second passport somewhere. What are we going to do when Britain crumbles or continues to crumble? And that is quite an alarming thing to hear people saying.
Yes, it's actually very sad. Is that really a prevalent opinion, something that you hear a lot, or is it like on the fringes where maybe, I don't know?
Well, it's hard to, you know what, it's hard to answer that question because each of us inhabits a particular position ourselves, and therefore we exist in what they might call an echo chamber or a group that we are more attuned to. But I certainly have heard that from a decent number of British people I know, and I observe it around me. I don't think it's necessarily a mainstream opinion or position, but again, for every person that said it, there'll be a number of people who've thought it or felt it. And I think that the other thing that we Jews maybe have learnt that other population groups aren't as finely tuned into is that it's sometimes better to think ahead, to plan for the worst, even if you hope for the best. And so I think there is a sense that you can be like the proverbial frog in the boiling pot of water. As things gradually get hotter, you may not realize what's happening until it's too late and you're already cooked. I think that still happens to Jewish people. So many Jewish people I know are saying these, they're cliches, but they're cliches for a reason because they represent a sort of truth that people feel. Now we understand why people didn't leave in time in Germany. Now we understand how people ended up getting stuck and it was too late. Maybe it's time for us to go. I think that Jewish people are more tuned into that than non-Jewish people. And the power of, I don't know if it's denial or just optimism of thinking, well, this will sort itself out, or we're Britain, we know how to deal with this, or Britain won't stand for this, there'll be a tipping point. I think there is a great deal of that feeling, which is, as I said, partly optimism or hopefulness. But I think that there are more and more signs that might not be the case, and that this might be actually too far. We might be too far gone. I think that there's a lot of people who aren't Jewish who are saying that. Whether you talk about things like two-tier policing, which has become a popular catchphrase here, refers to the idea that there are people who are in jail now for expressing opinions, like Lucy Connolly, the woman that made this tweet that said after the Southport stabbings, and there was some unrest in the streets that was aimed at immigrants, and despite the rights and wrongs of that, let's not get bogged down in that. She was put in jail for a tweet that she deleted after 4 hours, which was offensive and indicated that she wouldn't care if people burnt down hotels housing refugees in the UK. But there are, at the same time, people weekly expressing outrageous anti-Semitic opinion, threats against Jews, whether it's death to the IDF being chanted by potentially thousands of people at the Glastonbury Festival, or whether it's people on the streets of London calling for jihad, which eventually we were told jihad can have many different meanings, whether it's chants for globalize the intifada. There were people not being met with similar sentencing or even being charged as her for this one post on X that was taken down in 4 hours. The interesting counter piece of information to that is what's happening now, which is that a group called Palestine Action has recently been classed as a terrorist group here. They're the ones who broke into a UK airbase and sprayed red paint all over some of the military aircraft. They appeared to go in there and leave completely unchallenged, which in and of itself is indicative of a big security breach and failure on our part, especially in terms of our air force, our military. But also it was potentially sabotage of British aircraft. It could have genuinely had a dreadful effect. And they're a group that has engaged in these more outrageous acts of vandalism and activities that I think the government decided were, in my interpretation at least of their decision, designed to instill fear and terror into the population in pursuit of their political thoughts and ideas, which I guess is a definition of terrorism. So they were classed as terrorists. So now under UK law, to express support for that group means that you are breaking the law. You can't express support for Hamas. You can be arrested for that. And so now I think 40 people in the last day or two have been arrested for expressing support for Palestine Action, which is an interesting counterweight to this idea that people aren't necessarily being treated the same depending on their perceived crimes.
Yes, but arrested doesn't, we need to know what the actual punishment will be. People are arrested in New York, where I grew up, all the time for vandalizing stuff, and they're let out, like they go in and they go out. So you never know. And New York is going to have a now mayor probably that likes the Intifada. So we're a first, and he was one of the protesters that would go in and out. So we're great.
Yeah, well, we will see. Exactly. You're exactly right. Arrests are one thing, but it is a first step. We'll see that if these do follow through, people consider it quite draconian that somebody is in jail for a tweet. And by the way, it wasn't even, if I remember correctly, she didn't even say that people should go out and burn.
Said she wouldn't care if people.
She said that she wouldn't care, which it may be nitpicking, but I have to say I don't think that it's quite the same. And when you know that there are also imams in mosques in Britain videoed, it's been published in online and even on Talk TV and channels like that, giving Friday sermons in which they've called for the death of Jews. And those people inside the mosques who have genuine influence over a congregation, they are considered leaders, religious leaders over a group of people. They haven't been arrested or put in jail. They are apparently calling directly for killing Jews. The man who stood up at Glastonbury and called for death to IDF soldiers, again, calling for actual death, not saying for all I care, if they get killed, it wouldn't bother me. These people apparently are not being arrested and treated in the same way. And so I think the charge of two-tier policing is actually relatively fair. I don't know many people who think it is an unfair charge, except some in the government.
Can I just ask you about that Bob? I think they're called Villain, which is, they're so smart, play on Bob Dylan, but whatever. Another famous Jew, by the way. They called at this festival to kill all the IDF. There's no other way. Death to all the IDF. And I found two things that were very disturbing about this. First of all, the fact that it's even obviously said, okay, but the second thing is that the entire crowd cheers it back to them and chants it with them, and it sounds like there's thousands of people there. I'm not a big music lover goer, whatever. I have little children, so it's not my thing, but apparently this is like the biggest music festival in the UK, and thousands of people are there. No one is booing this. Everyone is chanting. No one seems to be leaving, at least from the videos that I saw, like in disgust. It's just normal. And then he goes on to sing songs that are against the UK itself, by the way. He sings that you want your country back, F you, and all this kind of stuff. So he's basically taunting not even Jews, just regular people in the UK, which goes back to what you're saying about non-Jews being fearful about what's happening. And and then the most amazing thing is that it seems as if there's no repercussions. So he gets knocked down by his agent, but okay, you could get a new agent. That's not a big thing. And they said there was a police investigation. I mean, I'm very pro free speech, but if you're arresting people for tweets, that are taken down after 4 hours and not doing anything to people who are literally chanting death to an entire group of people in front of thousands of people, the discrepancy is unbelievable.
That's right. I mean, this man who is a rapper, and I don't think many people I know had ever heard of him before this, chose the Glastonbury Festival to make those chants, death to the IDF, and as you said, you want your country back, but you can't have your country back. He also, in a little speech between some of his performance, talked about a former boss of his, a Jewish man, exactly, in quite offensive terms. All of those things were deeply alarming to many people, not just Jews. Apparently not to the BBC, who chose to keep broadcasting it live, and that's despite them registering that it had happened. I think they did put up a little warning on screen that maybe some of this is a bit naughty, but they didn't think it was worth taking down. Now they do. Now they think they should have taken it down. But like almost every instance of outrageous BBC bias against Jews or Israel, they only think so afterwards, after a lot of complaining from other people, and then they say, "Oh, we made a mistake. This doesn't align with the BBC's normal editorial values," which I would say is actually wrong. I would say they are the BBC's normal editorial values, exactly. But this guy, Pascal Robinson Foster, the rapper, said all that. I think there's so much to unpick in there, as you've started to. The idea, firstly, death to the IDF, the men and women of Israel who are fighting that existential war on 7 or 8 fronts, however you count it, who have been engaged in that for well over 20 months now, which is a war that I consider to be not just Israel's, but a war that has repercussions around the whole Middle East, if not the whole world, which are they're effectively fighting, as I see it, on behalf of the West in many respects, if only in a sense that what lies behind the specific wars that Israel is engaged in now are elements that really do threaten us here in the UK as well, namely the Islamic Republic of Iran, and more fundamentally extremist Islam and the challenges that has to Western values. But this guy, as you said, also chanted other things which are quite popular with reactionary far left groups. You want your country back. You can't have your country back. I think there was a graphic on the screen behind him that the Britain was built on the backs of immigrants, something along those lines. Of course, Britain wasn't necessarily built on the backs of immigrants. Britain has quite a long and proud history of, becoming the nation that it did. A lot of it.
But it also depends what immigrants. If you're an immigrant that comes out of accepting British culture and values and want to be part of society, it's very different than someone who's standing on a stage and saying, we don't want any party, we want to destroy the UK as is, you can't have your country back, and also death to the IDF and all the Jews and those evil Zionists. It's a big discrepancy between what kind of immigrant you are.
And you know what it highlighted for many of us is that those slogans aren't really deeply thought about by the people that chant them. I think, in his case, my own opinion is that probably he recognized this was his chance to become well known, and that certainly happened. And whether or not the negative side of that will outweigh the positive is something that remains to be seen. I had never heard of him, though I don't think I'm the target audience like you. I'm not a Glastonbury attendee ever. But he was meant to be the support before another group who the BBC had decided not to, I think, broadcast live. And they were, again, another viciously anti-Israel group, which I believe had expressed support for Hezbollah. And there was I think there is an ongoing legal case on that, so I don't want to say too much about it. The point being, though, that I think he knew that people who were there for that group maybe would react favorably towards.
He knew the fan base.
Yeah, exactly. But for the rest of us, it was deeply alarming because Glastonbury is known as this big moment in the British calendar of music and festivals. I know plenty of people who go to it. It's a kind of middle-aged, middle-class crowd, actually. It has this long history of being kind of peace-loving, left-wing event, as well as a music festival. And so I think it mirrored what's happened to that portion of political thought, which is it's less peace loving and less peaceful than it used to be. And now calling for the death of anybody is apparently unremarkable to certainly many people there. I read one report from a journalist in the Daily Mirror here, tabloid paper, who was there in that crowd. He said, as well as what we could see, there were people being sprayed with fake blood, probably from fire extinguishers in the crowd. And he said it felt quite horrific. Lots of people I know, genuinely, a lot of people I know have commented that this felt like watching a Nazi rally, because it was this kind of call for the death of Jews in the form of IDF soldiers, echoed by the crowd. And the reason I did also have this thought myself was that the Holocaust didn't start with 6 million dead Jews or the gas chambers. The Holocaust started, as with genocides generally, with something much earlier. And one of the key moments, I think, in genocide is that you can turn an ordinary population, not leaders, not even military people, but ordinary citizens, against a minority group or against a specific group, to the extent that they will then say and do horrific things that would have been unthinkable to them. So there are these reports, if you read about, for example, Rwanda, that ordinary people like teachers or I think even religious leaders would kill people with machetes.
And their neighbors.
Yes, neighbors or students, pupils that they had previously taught. And somehow some level of indoctrination has made them feel so negatively against that group that they're not deserving of life. They're worthy of brutal murder, that even they would be killed with machetes because it's more efficient, it doesn't waste ammunition, that sort of thing. And when you hear those kinds of reports, and then you see what is apparently a group of our peers in an audience echoing a chant, death to the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, there is a moment where you think, gosh, all those dinner parties, all those farmers markets, all those school meetings, all those local council meetings where we felt a frisson of anti-Semitism, an edge that maybe people were hating us because they've been indoctrinated to, suddenly it burst out into the open in this chant, echoed by apparently hundreds, possibly thousands of regular people. Forget this loser who was on the stage. It's the people who were echoing it that were most chilling to most of us.
And I'll tell you what is so, and to me at least, is that this, if it was this thing and then everyone says this is so bad and this will never happen again, and we are so, and we believe them, we would be okay, okay, it's a one-time thing. There's always crazy people, but I don't believe them. And the reason I don't believe them is, you mentioned the BBC just as an example, which seems to be, the BBC is funded by the British taxpayer. It's not like, some private company here that has a channel that's a random thing. It's literally funded by people who are, you have to pay if you have you have to license your TV, right? That's, I assume, how it works there. Used to work here like that. Thank God it's not like that anymore here. And The way it works is that you have this thing that's funded by you as a taxpayer, and they keep on promoting the most vicious lies about the one Jewish state. And like you said, the mistakes are always in one direction. So I believe you if you make a mistake to here and then to there. But if all your mistakes are all to one side, and then you keep on saying, no, it's just a mistake, it's not a mistake at that point. And that's why I think that when you have a structure that promotes this from the outside, so those people are chanting things that they heard from places, not the actual chants, but the reason for the chants on the BBC, for example. Because if you would just believe the BBC, you would think that Israel is literally going and executing people all over the place here. You would literally think that Israel is doing a genocide. You would literally think all these things that they're saying. There's no reason to not believe it if you're reading only BBC and some of the other places. Sky News, the UK is like just as bad, I think. And so my point is that the permission structure is there. So if the entire society would be against it, you would be ashamed to say those things as a crowd. But it's not. You're getting a wink and a nod and saying, no, 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 you're right. You're right. The IDF is these evil people. You're right that Israel doesn't have a right to exist because it's rooted in colonialist, whatever theories. So I guess my point is that if you would look at it in and of itself, you would be, okay, these things happen. But if you see the whole permission structure that's given to it, right?
I think that's exactly right. And I would even go so far as to say it's not even just a permission structure, it's indoctrination. So it's not just that it's permitting you to think it, it's actually causing you to think it, I think. And again, it's another thing that so many Jewish people have said. Jewish people generally have ties to Israel, and most Jewish people here are Zionists. And so I would say that we have usually better information, more detailed information about what's going on in Israel. I mean, I certainly, spend a lot of time in Israel and report on Israel for all of my career. So that's a different case. But even just a regular, non-journalist, non-politician, regular standard Jewish British person probably has family and friends in Israel, has some exposure to Israeli news, to information coming out of Israel. And if you do, I think you have become aware over the years, not just with what's going on since October the 7th, but for many years before, that the reporting that we see here in the British media and the wider Western media of especially wars going on in Israel, it's not reflective of the actual war that's going on. At best, it's a tiny part of what's going on. And at worst, it bears no resemblance to what's going on for one reason or another. So this war is a good example because the BBC and others have had this constant refrain, effectively, that, to paraphrase them, that Israel is this bloodthirsty, vengeful country trying to take out as many innocent Palestinians, predominantly women and children, out of a sense of biblically induced rage against a population that tried to burst out from a concentration camp or the world's biggest prison camp, and that they deserve everything they're getting, and yet they have this military machine bankrolled and tightly provided for by America, the world superpower, and they are slaughtering innocent people. And that is effectively the version of the war that has been represented over and over and over again by much of the media here, including the BBC. I would say that it is obviously bunkum. It is obviously rubbish. That, like all wars, there are plenty of really horrible, sad, ugly, hideous things. And as a former Golani soldier, you don't need me to tell you that. I'm sure you've seen plenty of it yourself. I'm lucky never to have had to serve in the armed forces myself, not having been Israeli. Wars are horrible.
I agree. And I just want to say, and this is important because it's not said enough, significant number of IDF soldiers have died just for the fact that Israel did not want to do a genocide.
Hundreds.
Yes, because if one of the things that people don't understand, I guess, from outside, that the Israeli public is very angry at its leaders for, is that it takes into consideration too much what people in the world will say and trying to stop innocent people from dying. And it comes at the expense of our sons and daughters who are dying in Gaza.
But you see, Ariel, this is the point. As I said, I've never, we don't have conscription here. I've never been, near fighting, frontline fighting personally as a soldier. I think that just that in and of itself is part of the issue. People here have absolutely no idea of those sorts of thoughts or feelings. Just to hear you say that would make many of them bristle or fume with rage, that how dare you say Israel should have taken fewer risks with its own soldiers and been more brutal with the enemy. How dare you say it? And these are all valid conversations about warfare. They are. But to have them from a position of comfort where you've never had, never mind as a soldier, but as a parent, as a friend, as an uncle, an aunt, a colleague, you've never had to experience what it is for soldiers made up of the whole population to have to go and fight to defend the country after a brutal, horrific, ideologically influenced and motivated attack on your people, civilians asleep in their beds, children, young people at a music festival not unlike Glastonbury, mass rape, kidnapping, burning, all of it, torture, not to have any idea what it is to know people who experience that, and then to know the people whose job it is to go and combat that enemy from doing it again, and to release your friends and family who are being held hostage and tortured and starved. Not to know that directly means that, yes, of course you can have an opinion and join in the debate about the rights and wrongs of particular strategies of war, or proportionality of actions in war, or any of those things. Of course, it's a valid discussion. But it should make you think, perhaps people who've experienced that their whole life maybe have a different balance or a different attitude towards it from you. And it might not be a simple case of black and white, wrong and right. It's such a complicated issue that I think the bit that really upsets people here, Jewish people predominantly, but others as well, is that there's no appreciation of the complexity of making those decisions, of the human costs on both sides. There's an enormous move to feel sympathy for the human costs among the Palestinian Arabs of Gaza or elsewhere, but there is almost no appreciation of what the Jews and non-Jews of Israel, the soldiers and their families and their friends, the hostages and their families and their friends, of what they are feeling, of how their minds work, of how their calculus operates. And even up to the Prime Minister, there is just almost unrestrained hatred in the British media towards Benjamin Netanyahu and his government. They are painted in two-dimensional caricature forms as far-right, fascist, power-hungry, corrupt people who only want to make decisions based on staying in power. Now, if any of those things I just said have elements of truth, and that's an if they have elements of truth in the decision-making process that those politicians go through, I think you have to be, I don't know what, to imagine that those are the only motivating factors that those people have in mind when they're making decisions about the war. And I think that if you bear in mind that quite a lot of people in Israel these days are not willing to see it in more complex terms than that. There are people in Israel who will only see decisions that Prime Minister Netanyahu makes in terms of corruption, keeping himself in power, keeping himself out of jail, stopping corruption charges. What hope is there outside Israel that people will be able to see a little bit more nuance to the decision-making process? And the New York Times piece that's just been debated quite vociferously now is another good example. It's about trying to appreciate that all human beings, I think, have a number of different conscious and unconscious factors that help them decide how to behave and act. And especially when you're in charge of an army, in charge of a country, you make decisions based on a vast number of factors, that some of which you know about and some of which you don't. And yet the media here just chooses to paint it entirely as a system, as I said, of bloodthirsty, religiously motivated maniacs who are trying to take revenge on a pure and innocent group of helpless people. Neither side of those descriptions is accurate. Neither side at all is even anywhere close to accurate. And yet the people on the street, the people in the crowd at Glastonbury, the moron on the stage jumping up and down, shouting for death, those people, I don't think, have any idea that they're not even thinking about this in the right terms.
Yes, and I would just say to finish this off, because I really appreciate it. It's been a very interesting and I think good conversation. I would just say that I think you're being too kind, meaning the reason why I think you're being too kind is that I think that they have nefarious motives, a lot of them, because what I used to talk like you did, and then happened the beeper attack on Hezbollah, and the beeper attack was the most precise, most the most non-kill, like non-collateral damage strike in the history of strikes. It attacked every single person that it blew up was a member of Hezbollah or someone who was so close to him that you couldn't. There was no other way, but it was meant specifically to each one members of Hezbollah's military wing who had these beepers. They were specifically sold to the military wing, not the political wing. And these people still complain and said that Israel is killing too many innocent people and it's indiscriminate. This was the most discriminate attack in the history of attacks. There's no other way you can be discriminate about attacking someone. And they still said it. And at that point, I was like, that's it. You're not serious.
I'll say this. I do genuinely try in my own thinking to afford people what you might call the benefit of the doubt, or to assume in other people what I hope they will assume in me and others, even that they don't agree with, which is that there could be motivating factors which aren't malice, bad will, etc. But that doesn't mean that I don't acknowledge that those things are sometimes the motivations. The same way as people will say to me, oh, you think everybody is anti-Semitic who is criticizing Israel. Of course, I don't think everybody is anti-Semitic who's criticizing Israel. I don't think that anti-Semitism is the only reason you can criticize Israel. But I do think that at the moment, quite a large number of them are anti-Semites. So I do acknowledge what you say. I just think it's important that if I expect of other people that they should afford at least a little bit of room for thought, that my motivations or the motivations of the people that I have sympathies towards or understanding of, if I should hope they will understand that those people don't act out of two-dimensional, evil, nefarious motivations, that maybe I need to do the same to them. But other than that, I will say that you are right. I think that a lot of the reactions and statements and actions and thoughts that have been so boldly and clearly expressed in an unbridled and horrible and scary and nasty way over the last 20 months have indicated that certainly there are a lot of people who harbor really objectionable, racist, offensive, nasty, even evil in cases, views about Jewish people, about Israel, about survival, about right and wrong, about civilization, about our values. And those things ultimately are what depress me, worry me, concern me the most. And I think, though, that there are more and more people here in the UK, Jewish and non-Jewish, who feel that way. And one of the reasons that I think it's important for all of us who work, as you and I do as journalists, to be more outspoken about this is that the politeness of holding it in, of trying to be restrained about stating these things, sometimes feels like it's failed, and that maybe now we need to let others know that you can talk about these things, you can discuss them, you can say them, and do so in a civilized and rational and fair way, especially with people who don't necessarily agree with you. And through that process, maybe we can find a route to a resolution, rather than what I think is happening ever more in our era, especially spurred on by algorithmic tendencies and by the constant quest for clicks and likes and views and shares. And we see it in things like Piers Morgan's show. I think there is a tendency instead towards more fire and fury, more rage, more screaming over each other, more abuse against each other, less understanding, less openness to hearing other ideas, and that is not going to help us. That's only going to help us spiral ever further into this abyss of horror that is just genuinely striking fear into so many people about our future.
Jonathan Sacerdoti, I said that right?
You did.
It was a pleasure talking to you. I really appreciate it. I think you're doing very important work, and not a lot of people are doing it. So thank you so much for being with us and for doing all the work that you do. And hopefully we hear from you soon. This conversation was very good, very important. And I hope everyone takes from it. And like you said, doesn't hold back when it's important to speak up civilly, but to do it and not be scared. So thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you very much, Ariel.